A black CEO. Fresh from announcing a groundbreaking initiative that promised to uplift marginalized communities. Was ready to board her private jet and head home. But when she arrived at the terminal, everything changed. A flight attendant, fueled by assumptions, dismissed her credentials and humiliated her in front of the crew. Just 15 minutes later, the tables turned in a way no one expected. And what unfolded left everyone stunned and set off a ripple effect that no one could have foreseen. What happened next is a story of resilience, power, and the quiet strength that dismantles prejudice. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice, courage, and transformation. It started like any other day. The private airport terminal gleamed under the morning sun, its polished floors and expansive windows reflecting a world designed for quiet affluence. The hum of soft conversations and the occasional clatter of fine porcelain cups added to the air of exclusivity. Olivia Carter adjusted the lapels of her blazer, her fingers brushing against the pearls at her neck. An unconscious gesture she had perfected over decades of entering rooms where her presence was questioned before she even spoke. At 58, Olivia was more than accustomed to the unspoken hierarchies that define spaces like these. A self-made businesswoman, she had forged a path through industries where doors were rarely opened for people who looked like her. Her success was undeniable, yet it never seemed to be quite enough. The world had a way of reminding her that no amount of money or accolades could erase the quiet scrutiny that followed her like a shadow. She stepped to the check-in counter, her posture deliberate and poised. The young attendant behind the desk offered a polished smile, one Olivia recognized as more habit than warmth. "Name and flight details, please," the attendant said, not looking up. "Olivia Carter," Olivia replied, her voice calm. "Private flight to New York." The attendant's fingers paused over the keyboard, her eyes flicking upward. The moment was subtle but unmistakable. A slight narrowing of the gaze. A flicker of surprise. Olivia felt it in her gut, though her expression didn't betray her. This was a look she had encountered her entire life, the silent question of whether she belonged here. "Just a moment, ma'am," the attendant said, her smile tightening. She glanced at the screen, then back at Olivia. "This is a private charter." "I know," Olivia said, her tone measured. "It's my charter." The attendant's cheeks reddened, and she nodded quickly. "Of course, Ms. Carter, you're all set to board." Olivia turned toward the gate, the faint click of her heels echoing in the quiet space. She could feel the eyes on her back. Not hostile, not overtly unkind, but curious, as if her presence needed explanation. It was a reminder of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like these, where power was often assumed to look a certain way and where any deviation from that assumption became a point of quiet contention. At the foot of the jet's stairs, Captain Mitchell Hayes stood waiting. His stance was formal, his uniform immaculate, but there was something in his expression. A cool detachment, a calculated appraisal, that sent a chill through Olivia. He didn't move as she approached, his eyes scanning her in a way that felt more invasive than professional. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone clipped. Olivia stopped, meeting his gaze with the practiced calm she had honed over years of moments like this. "I'm here for the flight to New York." Hayes's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This is a private charter," he said, as though explaining something she couldn't possibly understand. "Yes," Olivia said, her voice steady. "It's my charter." The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a faint, humorless smirk. "Right," he said, folding his arms. "And I'm the CEO of Boeing." Olivia's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, her expression unyielding. Finally, she retrieved her phone and opened an email, holding it out for him to see. The details were clear: her name, her destination, her ownership of the jet. Hayes's smirk faded as he scanned the screen, his jaw tightening. He handed the phone back without a word, stepping aside reluctantly. "Welcome aboard," he muttered. Olivia climbed the steps, her movements deliberate, her back straight. Inside, the cabin was as she had designed it, a sanctuary of understated elegance. With soft leather seats, walnut accents, and ambient lighting that bathed the space in warmth. Yet as she set her bag down and took her seat, the tension from outside lingered, coiled around her like a second skin. Moments later, Erin, a young flight attendant, appeared, her smile polite but tentative. "Can I get you something to drink, Ms. Carter?" "Water, please," Olivia said. Erin nodded, but her steps faltered as Captain Hayes entered the cabin. His presence filled the space, his gaze sweeping over Olivia before he turned to Erin. "Step outside with me for a moment," he said, his voice low but firm. Erin glanced at Olivia, her expression uncertain. Before following Hayes out, the door hissed softly as it closed, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrests. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know its tone. This was a dance she had participated in too many times, a silent negotiation of her legitimacy in spaces that were supposed to be hers. When Erin returned, her steps were hesitant, her smile strained. She placed the glass of water on Olivia's tray table and murmured, "Let me know if you need anything else." Olivia watched her retreat, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to press, she already understood. The conversation had likely been some version of what it always was: quiet doubt, coded language, a reluctance to accept her authority without challenge. As the engines roared to life and the jet began to taxi, Olivia stared out the window. The world outside blurred, its sharp edges softened by speed and distance. Yet inside, the tension remained, a reminder that no amount of success could insulate her from the small, persistent ways the world tried to diminish her. This flight was not just a journey to New York, it was another chapter in a lifelong story. And though Olivia was tired, though the weight of these encounters bore down on her with each passing year, she knew she couldn't stop. Not for herself, but for those who would follow. The young girls watching, waiting, believing that one day the world might look at them and see not their difference, but their worth. The jet ascended smoothly, slicing through the sky with a grace that belied the tension within. The hum of the engines was steady, rhythmic, but in Olivia Carter's ears, it was drowned out by the memory of Captain Hayes's smirk and the attendant's hesitant demeanor. These moments, small and seemingly inconsequential, were the most insidious. They lodged themselves in the corners of her mind, not as rage but as weariness. It was the kind of exhaustion that came not from a single event but from the accumulation of 1,000 small cuts, each one reminding her that even in spaces she had earned, she was still an anomaly. She stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, her reflection a faint overlay on the world outside. The door to the cockpit opened, breaking her reverie. Captain Hayes stepped into the cabin, his tall frame filling the doorway. His expression was composed, but there was an edge to his movements, a stiffness that betrayed his discomfort. He stood there for a moment, scanning the cabin as if searching for something to assert control over. Finally, he walked toward Olivia, his hands clasped behind his back. "Dr. Carter," he said, his tone overly formal, as though the title itself was a burden to say. "I just wanted to personally ensure that everything is satisfactory for you during the flight." Olivia turned to him, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Everything is fine, Captain Hayes, thank you." He hesitated, clearly expecting more, either gratitude or confrontation. When none came, he pressed on. "This flight, you understand, is typically reserved for our corporate partners and executives." "I wasn't aware," he trailed off, his words dangling like bait. "I'm aware of the flight's typical clientele," Olivia said calmly. "I'm also aware that I own this jet." His lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest flush creeping up his neck. "Of course," he said, stepping back. "If there's anything else you need." "There isn't," she replied, her voice polite but firm, a dismissal wrapped in civility. As he returned to the cockpit, Olivia exhaled slowly. The interaction had been brief, but its weight lingered. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. The undertones, the implication that her presence required explanation or justification. It was all too familiar. Erin, the young flight attendant, reappeared shortly after, her movements brisk but tentative. She carried a tray with a neatly arranged meal, placing it on Olivia's table with the careful precision of someone desperate to avoid mistakes. "Will there be anything else, Miss Carter?" she asked, her voice soft. Olivia glanced at the tray. "This is fine, thank you." Erin lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to say more, but instead, she retreated to the galley, her footsteps barely audible over the engine's hum. Olivia could feel the unspoken tension radiating from her, an unease born of being caught between authority and principle. It was a position Olivia knew well, one she had occupied many times in her younger years. She pushed the food around her plate absent-mindedly, her appetite dulled by the events of the morning. The quiet battles she fought were the kind that didn't announce themselves but instead crept in, settling into her bones like an unwelcome chill. They were the moments that forced her to choose, again and again, between addressing the slight and preserving her energy for larger wars. The jet hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting her slightly in her seat. She gripped the armrests, her eyes instinctively moving to the galley where Erin and another flight attendant, Laura, were whispering. Their voices were low, but Olivia caught fragments of the conversation. "She didn't even flinch," Erin said, her tone tinged with something between awe and disbelief. "What did you expect?" Laura replied. "Women like her, they have to be tough. Always have something to prove." The words stung, not for their malice but for their accuracy. Olivia leaned back in her seat, her fingers loosening on the armrests. Women like her. It wasn't the first time she had been categorized, reduced to a type rather than recognized as an individual. She had long since stopped expecting otherwise. The turbulence subsided, and the jet steadied once more. Olivia closed her eyes, trying to center herself, but the quiet didn't last. The cockpit door opened again, and Captain Hayes emerged, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the cabin like a man searching for control. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to be noticed. "A moment of turbulence, nothing to worry about, but I must remind you to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." Olivia opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I haven't moved, Captain." He blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Of course," he said quickly, "just a precaution." She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but pointed. "Thank you for your concern, Captain." Hayes nodded curtly and returned to the cockpit, his retreat less confident than his arrival. Olivia exhaled, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The interactions were small, almost trivial on the surface, but they carried the same undercurrent of mistrust that she had encountered her entire life. Erin returned, her movements even more hesitant than before. She placed a fresh glass of water on Olivia's table, her hands trembling slightly. Olivia noticed but said nothing. Instead, she picked up the glass, her gaze fixed on the young woman. "Are you all right, Erin?" Olivia asked, her voice soft but direct. Erin froze, her eyes widening. "Yes, ma'am," she said quickly. "I'm fine." Olivia studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Let me know if you need anything." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Erin nodded quickly, retreating once more to the galley. Olivia turned her attention back to the window, her reflection faint against the backdrop of endless blue sky. The day wasn't over, and she knew the challenges would continue to rise. But she also knew that every step forward, every moment of composure, was a victory in itself. The fight for dignity was never loud. It was quiet, deliberate, and unrelenting. And Olivia Carter had long since learned how to wield that silence as her greatest strength. The jet had leveled out at cruising altitude, the sky outside a vast expanse of soft blue and white. Olivia Carter sat still, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her mind sifting through the morning's events like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The air inside the cabin was calm, almost serene, but it carried a tension that felt alive, subtle, but persistent, like the faint hum of the engines. It wasn't what people said that gnawed at her, it was what they didn't. The silences, the glances, the hesitations, all the ways the world communicated its disbelief without ever putting it into words. It was exhausting in a way that made her shoulders feel heavy and her mind raced with questions that had no answers. She had spent her life mastering the art of composure, But there were moments like this, when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Erin appeared again, her smile strained, a faint tremor in her hands as she placed a cup of coffee on the table beside Olivia. "I thought you might like something warm, Miss Carter," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Thank you," Olivia replied, her tone polite but firm. She picked up the cup, letting its warmth settle into her palms. Erin lingered for a moment, her eyes darting toward the cockpit before quickly excusing herself. Olivia watched her retreat, sensing the young woman's unease. It wasn't directed at Olivia, but it was there, palpable and unresolved. Moments later, the door to the cockpit opened again, and Captain Hayes emerged. His posture was stiff, his movements deliberate, as though every step was calculated to convey authority. He paused in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the cabin before landing on Olivia. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone measured but carrying an edge of defensiveness. "I wanted to address the earlier turbulence. It's standard procedure to keep all passengers informed, especially during unexpected conditions." Olivia set down her coffee, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I appreciate the explanation, Captain. Is there something else you'd like to address?" The question was direct, her gaze unwavering. Hayes shifted slightly, his expression faltering for the briefest moment before he recovered. "No, that will be all," he said, retreating to the cockpit. Olivia exhaled, her fingers tightening briefly on the armrest. It was like this, always like this, a performance of power, subtle but undeniable, designed to remind her of the precariousness of her place in spaces like these. She had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. But even at the peak of her success, there were those who sought to question her right to be there. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Breaking her thoughts, she picked it up, seeing a message from a colleague. "Your keynote was incredible." The board was thrilled. A faint smile crossed her lips. But it didn't last. The validation was welcome, but it couldn't erase the lingering frustration that seemed to cling to her like a shadow. The quiet of the cabin was interrupted by the sound of whispered voices. Erin and Laura were speaking in hushed tones near the galley, their words just barely audible over the hum of the engines. "She doesn't even seem upset," Laura said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That's what makes it worse," Erin replied. "She's so calm. It's like, I don't know, like she's used to it." Olivia's grip on her phone tightened. The words weren't meant for her, but they landed all the same. Used to it. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at the cruel irony of having to adapt to a world that refused to adapt to her. But the laughter wouldn't come. Instead, she let out a slow, steady breath, grounding herself in the stillness she had learned to cultivate. The jet hit another pocket of turbulence. A brief but sharp jolt that made the cabin lights flicker. Erin reappeared almost immediately, her face pale as she checked on Olivia. "Are you all right, Miss Carter?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm fine," Olivia said, her tone calm. "Thank you." Erin nodded quickly, retreating to the galley once more. Olivia watched her go, her expression unreadable. It wasn't Erin's fault. Not entirely. The young woman was caught in a system that had taught her to see people like Olivia as anomalies, as exceptions to a rule that shouldn't exist but did. And yet, Olivia couldn't bring herself to offer comfort. She was too tired, too drained from a lifetime of carrying the burden of other people's discomfort. As the jet steadied, Olivia leaned back in her seat. Closing her eyes briefly, she thought of her mother, a woman who had faced her own battles with a quiet strength that Olivia had tried to emulate. "Dignity," her mother had once said, "isn't about how the world treats you. It's about how you refuse to let it define you." The words echoed in her mind, a reminder of the resilience that had brought her this far. But resilience, she knew, came at a cost. It demanded more of her than it should, leaving her with little room to simply exist without the need to prove herself. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Olivia sipped her coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of the distance between her and the world below. She felt that distance keenly, not just in miles but in understanding. There were parts of her experience that would always remain invisible to those who hadn't lived it, no matter how much she tried to explain. As the jet began its descent, Erin reappeared once more, her expression carefully neutral. "We'll be landing shortly, Miss Carter," she said. "Is there anything else you need before we arrive?" Olivia shook her head. "No, thank you." Erin hesitated, as though she wanted to say something more. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded and disappeared toward the galley. Olivia watched her go, her thoughts a quiet storm of frustration and resolve. The day wasn't over, and she knew the challenges would continue to mount. But she also knew she was prepared. She always was. The jet touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with practiced ease. As the cabin door opened to the crisp air outside, Olivia gathered her things, her movements deliberate. She stepped onto the tarmac with her head held high, ready for whatever lay ahead. The battle wasn't over, but it never was, and Olivia Carter had long since learned how to fight. The tarmac shimmered under the midday sun, its heat rising in faint, invisible waves. Olivia Carter descended the steps of her private jet, her heels clicking sharply against the metal. Each step was deliberate, her posture straight and poised, her expression composed. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind churned with the morning's events. The air was crisp, cooler than she expected, and it carried with it a faint promise of fall. She inhaled deeply, as though the act itself could fortify her for what lay ahead. A black sedan waited at the edge of the runway, its sleek body reflecting the sky above. As Olivia approached, Marcus, her driver of 10 years, stepped out to greet her. "Welcome back, Dr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice warm but professional as he opened the door. "Thank you, Marcus," Olivia replied, her tone softening ever so slightly. It was a small reprieve, this brief exchange, but she clung to it as she slid into the backseat. The ride into the city was quiet, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to her thoughts. Olivia watched the landscape change, the open expanse of the airport giving way to the dense, bustling city. Chicago rose before her, its skyline etched against the horizon, a testament to ambition and resilience. It was a city that had seen its share of struggles, much like Olivia herself. As they approached Harper Holdings, the company Olivia had built from the ground up, Marcus cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter, there's a bit of a situation outside the building." Olivia looked up, her brows knitting slightly. "What kind of situation?" Marcus hesitated, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Protesters. They've gathered near the entrance." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the building came into view. A small crowd had assembled on the sidewalk, their signs raised high. Most of the messages were pointed but civil. Calls for accountability, demands for transparency. But a few bore words that cut deeper. "Who's really in charge?" and "diversity theater." Olivia's jaw tightened, but her expression remained otherwise neutral. This wasn't new. The scrutiny, the questioning of her legitimacy. It was part and parcel of her journey. But it didn't make it easier. "Take me to the main entrance," she said firmly. Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure, Dr. Carter?" Security suggested. Quote, "I'm sure," she said, her voice leaving no room for debate. The car pulled to a stop, and Olivia stepped out, her movements deliberate. The crowd quieted for a moment as they noticed her, their chants pausing as if recalibrating. She walked past them with her head held high, her heels clicking against the pavement, her presence commanding but unspoken. She didn't look at the signs or the faces holding them. To acknowledge them was to give them power. And Olivia had learned long ago that power was not to be given freely. Inside the building, the atmosphere was no less charged. The sleek, modern lobby, with its high ceilings and minimalist design, was usually a place of calm efficiency. Today, it buzzed with a tension that was palpable. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, greeted Olivia with a strained smile. "Good morning, Dr. Carter," Claire said, her voice a touch too bright. "Mr. Thompson is waiting for you in the boardroom." "Thank you, Claire," Olivia replied, her tone cool but polite. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet, the faint hum of its ascent matching the rhythm of Olivia's thoughts. When the doors opened, she stepped into the executive suite, her presence drawing immediate attention. The staff paused in their movements, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. Olivia ignored them, her focus set on the boardroom at the end of the hall. Inside, the boardroom was a picture of calculated power, a long, polished table, leather chairs arranged with precision, and a wall of windows offering a sweeping view of the city. The executives were already seated, their conversations hushed as Olivia entered. Robert Thompson, the senior vice president, stood as she approached. "Dr. Carter," he said, his tone overly formal, "thank you for joining us on short notice. I wasn't aware it was optional." Olivia replied smoothly as she took her seat at the head of the table. A faint murmur rippled through the room before Robert cleared his throat. His discomfort evident. "We've called this meeting to discuss the protests outside. They seem to be related to the new initiative. And there's concern about how it's being perceived." "Perceived by whom?" Olivia asked, her gaze steady. Robert hesitated. "The stakeholders. Primarily, there's a growing sentiment that the initiative may be moving too quickly. That it lacks the necessary support." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but her voice sharp. "Support or compliance, Robert? Because they're not the same." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes avoiding hers. Robert pressed on, his tone measured but condescending. "With all due respect, Dr. Carter, perhaps we need to consider the optics here. The protests, quote, are not the issue." Olivia interrupted, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "The issue is our unwillingness to confront the systems that create those protests in the first place. If we're waiting for the world to hand us perfect conditions, we'll be waiting forever." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that none of them seemed willing to meet. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her gaze sweeping the room. "If anyone has a substantive objection to the initiative, one rooted in data, not fear, I'm willing to hear it. Otherwise, we move forward." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. Robert glanced at the others, clearly searching for support, but no one spoke. Finally, he nodded, his voice subdued. "Very well, Dr. Carter." As the meeting adjourned, Olivia lingered in the boardroom, her gaze fixed on the city below. The protests were still visible from this height, their signs tiny but persistent. She thought of her mother's words, spoken so many years ago, "They'll build walls to keep you out." But walls are only as strong as the silence around them. Olivia straightened her blazer, her resolve hardening. The walls were there, yes, but she had spent her life learning how to tear them down. One battle at a time. The day's shadows stretched long against the pavement as Olivia Carter descended the steps of Harper Holdings' boardroom, her heels echoing softly in the marble hallway. She moved with the grace of someone who understood that the world was always watching, even when it pretended not to be. The tension from the meeting still clung to her, its weight pressing against her shoulders. Outside the tall glass windows, the crowd of protesters had grown. Their chants were faint but rhythmic, rising like a pulse against the city's hum. As she passed by the executive offices, Olivia noticed her assistant Mara waiting outside her door. Mara's expression was tight, her hands clutching a tablet close to her chest. "Dr. Carter," Mara began, her voice low, "there's been an email circulating among the senior staff." Olivia raised an eyebrow but didn't stop walking. "Go on." "It's about the initiative," Mara said, quickening her steps to keep pace. "Some of the executives are voicing concerns privately. They're questioning your decision to push forward so aggressively." Olivia paused outside her office, her hand resting on the door handle. "And who, specifically, is questioning it?" Mara hesitated, her gaze dropping. "Robert, mostly, but a few others seem to be backing him." Olivia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the door. It wasn't unexpected. Robert had been undermining her since the day she hired him. But there was something different now, a boldness in his resistance that suggested he thought he had the upper hand. "Forward me the email," Olivia said finally, stepping into her office, "and schedule a meeting with the full executive team for tomorrow morning." Mara nodded and left quickly, her steps fading down the hall. Olivia closed the door behind her, the quiet of her office enveloping her like a sanctuary. She moved to the large window that overlooked the city, her reflection merging with the skyline beyond. The protesters were still there, their signs waving in the evening breeze. Olivia's phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a text from Marcus. "The car is ready whenever you are." She replied with a brief, "Thank you," before placing the phone back down. The car would have to wait. There was still work to do. That evening, Olivia stayed late in her office, poring over the details of the initiative Robert and his allies seemed so intent on stalling. The project was ambitious, yes, but it was also necessary. A bold investment in underserved communities that would expand Harper Holdings' reach while addressing systemic inequities in access to capital. It was the kind of initiative that required courage. And courage, Olivia knew, was in short supply among her colleagues. As she reviewed the numbers, she found herself thinking about her father. He had worked as a janitor in an office building much like this one, pushing a mop through silent halls long after the executives had gone home. She remembered how he'd come home each night, his hands calloused, his face tired but proud. "It's not the work that defines you," he'd told her once. "It's what you make of it." Those words had guided her for decades, propelling her through spaces that were never designed for her to succeed. But tonight, as she stared at the spreadsheet in front of her, they felt heavy. It wasn't just the work that defined her anymore. It was the resistance to her doing it. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Olivia glanced up to see Mara standing there again, her expression more urgent this time. "What is it?" Olivia asked. "There's something else you should know," Mara said, stepping inside. "The protesters, they're planning to escalate. They've announced on social media that they'll be back tomorrow morning with a larger group. Some of them are calling for you to step down." Olivia sat back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't the first time her leadership had been challenged, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But there was something about the relentlessness of it all, the internal and external pressures colliding, that made her chest tighten. "Let them come," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We'll be ready." Mara hesitated, as though she wanted to say more, but instead, she nodded and left the room. Olivia returned to the spreadsheet, but her focus had shifted. The numbers blurred as her mind replayed the day's events. The looks, the whispers, the careful resistance dressed up as concern. The next morning, the atmosphere outside Harper Holdings was electric. The protesters had gathered early, their ranks swelling as more people joined. The signs were bolder now, their messages more pointed. "Leadership without justice is tyranny," and "Olivia Carter, progress or performance." Inside, the executive team assembled in the boardroom, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and defensiveness. Olivia entered last, her presence silencing the room. She took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her. "I understand there are concerns about the initiative," she began, her voice steady. "Let's address them." Robert was the first to speak, his tone measured but condescending. "Dr. Carter, with all due respect, the protests outside are a clear indication that we're moving too quickly." "The public perception," quote, "public perception," Olivia interrupted, her eyes locking onto him. "Or your perception?" Robert's face reddened, but he pressed on. "The point is, we're risking the company's reputation by pushing forward without broader consensus." Olivia leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "And tell me, Robert, how do you propose we build that consensus? By waiting? By diluting our vision until it's palatable to everyone?" Progress has never come from waiting. It comes from action. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Olivia let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "This initiative isn't about appeasing the status quo. It's about challenging it, and if that makes people uncomfortable, then we're on the right path." She stood, her posture commanding. "If anyone here has a valid reason, supported by data, not fear, for delaying this initiative, speak now. Otherwise, we move forward." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked away, his confidence visibly shaken. The others exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. "Good," Olivia said, her voice firm. "Then let's get to work." As the meeting ended and the executives filed out, Olivia returned to her office. She stood by the window, watching the protesters below. Their chants were loud, their presence impossible to ignore. But Olivia didn't feel intimidated. If anything, she felt resolved. The fight for progress was never easy. And the cost was always high. But as Olivia Carter stared down at the crowd, she knew she was ready to pay it. She had been paying it her entire life. The sun was climbing higher over Chicago, its light glinting off the glass facade of Harper Holdings. The crowd outside had swollen to twice its size, their chants and signs now amplified by the presence of news cameras and reporters stationed at the edges of the scene. Olivia Carter stood in her office, watching from above as the city seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. The tension hung thick in the air, unspoken but tangible, as though the walls themselves could sense the unease. The executive team had dispersed after the morning's meeting. But Olivia knew that Robert and his allies were still plotting. Their resistance wasn't loud. It never was. But it rippled beneath the surface, feeding on the fears and doubts of those too cautious to speak out. Olivia's assistant, Mara, knocked softly before stepping inside. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "The media is requesting a statement about the protests." Olivia turned, her expression unreadable. "And what are they asking?" Mara hesitated. "They want to know if Harper Holdings is reconsidering the initiative. Some are questioning whether it's the right move for the company." Olivia nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back to the window. She could see the faces in the crowd. Young, old, black, white, all united in their demand for answers. But it wasn't their questions that troubled her. It was the subtle shift in the narrative. The way the protesters' demands were being co-opted by those inside the company who sought to undermine her. "Draft a statement," Olivia said finally. "Reiterate our commitment to the initiative. Make it clear that we stand by our decision." Mara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Do you want to address the criticism directly?" "No," Olivia replied, her tone firm. "This isn't about defending myself. It's about standing firm in the face of doubt." By midday, the pressure had reached a boiling point. The media coverage had intensified, and Harper Holdings' phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned stakeholders. Olivia remained composed, but she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her like a physical force. It was during a brief moment of quiet that the email arrived. The subject line read, "Private concerns regarding leadership." Olivia's jaw tightened as she opened it. The message was from Robert, but it was addressed to the entire executive team. In it, he questioned her ability to lead effectively during a crisis, suggesting that her approach was alienating key stakeholders and jeopardizing the company's future. It wasn't the first time her leadership had been challenged, but the blatant nature of the attack took her breath away. Robert's words were carefully chosen, cloaked in the language of concern and professionalism, but their intent was clear. He was positioning himself as the voice of reason, the one willing to say what others might not. Olivia stared at the screen, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. For a moment, she felt the familiar sting of anger, the kind that threatened to consume her if she let it. But she pushed it down, channeling it into something sharper, something more focused. She picked up her phone and called Mara. "Schedule a meeting with the full board," she said. "Today." The boardroom was silent as Olivia entered, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The executives were seated around the long table, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright unease. Robert sat near the far end, his posture confident but his eyes wary. Olivia didn't waste time. She placed the printed copy of Robert's email on the table, her movements deliberate. "This was sent to the executive team earlier today," she began, her voice calm but firm. "It questions not just my leadership but the direction of this company." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "Let me be clear. I will not tolerate attempts to undermine our mission or my authority. If anyone here believes that they are better suited to lead Harper Holdings, I invite you to say so now." The room was silent. Robert shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering under Olivia's gaze. No one spoke. "Good," Olivia said, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "Because this initiative is moving forward. And so am I." The meeting ended, but the echoes of it lingered in Olivia's mind as she returned to her office. She stood by the window, watching the protesters below. Their chants were still loud, their signs still bold, But Olivia felt a strange sense of calm. The real battles weren't fought in the streets. They were fought in the quiet rooms where decisions were made, where power was wielded in whispers and glances. As the sun began to set, Olivia picked up her phone and dialed Marcus. "Bring the car around," she said. "I'm ready to leave." When she stepped outside, the crowd turned their attention to her. The cameras flashed. The chants grew louder, but Olivia walked past them with the same quiet dignity she had carried her entire life. She didn't stop, didn't flinch, because she knew that her strength came not from their approval but from her refusal to be moved by their doubts. As the car pulled away, Olivia looked out the window at the city fading into the distance. The day had been long, the challenges relentless, but she felt no despair. If anything, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Olivia Carter had never been one to back down from a fight. The evening air was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths as Olivia Carter's car pulled into her driveway. The house stood tall and elegant, its clean lines and sharp angles illuminated by the soft glow of exterior lights. It was a symbol of her success, a fortress she had built brick by brick. But tonight, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage, one where the past, present, and future converged in uneasy tension. Inside, she slipped off her heels and placed her bag on the kitchen counter. The silence of the house pressing in around her. She made herself a cup of tea. The act mechanical, her mind elsewhere, the events of the day replayed in her thoughts, the protests, the boardroom confrontation, and Robert's calculated email. These were not isolated incidents, they were pieces of a larger, relentless pattern, a reminder that no matter how high she climbed, the ground beneath her was never entirely stable. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the stillness. It was a message from Mara. "I've confirmed tomorrow's media briefing. Let me know if there's anything else I can do." Olivia typed a quick reply. "Thank you. Get some rest." But she doubted either of them would sleep much tonight. The next morning, Harper Holdings was a hive of activity. The media briefing had drawn reporters from across the city. Their vans parked along the curb, cameras aimed at the building's entrance. Inside, Olivia prepared in her office, the air thick with anticipation. Mara entered with a clipboard, her expression as tight as the knot in Olivia's stomach. "Everything's set," Mara said, her voice low. "The talking points are on the podium. But, they're going to push you on the protests. And the email." Olivia nodded, her face unreadable. "Let them." As she stepped out of her office, the murmur of activity in the building seemed to hush. Her heels clicked against the polished floors, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the doubt that lingered in the air. By the time she reached the conference room, the energy was palpable. Reporters shuffled in their seats, their pens poised, their eyes fixed on the podium. Olivia approached the microphone, her presence commanding. She began with the prepared remarks, outlining the goals of the initiative with precision and clarity. But she knew this wasn't enough. The room was waiting for something more, something unscripted. And Olivia, ever aware of the power of the moment, obliged. "I know there are questions," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Questions about my leadership, about this initiative, and about the protests outside. Let me be clear. I welcome those questions, because they force us to confront not just the challenges of this project, but the challenges embedded in the very fabric of our society." The room was silent, the tension almost palpable. Olivia continued, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "The protests outside are not just about this company or this initiative. They are about the larger systems that have excluded so many for so long. And while I understand the discomfort this brings, I refuse to let that discomfort deter us from doing what is right." A hand shot up in the crowd. It was a reporter from a local news station, her expression sharp. "Dr. Carter, how do you respond to the accusations that you're using this initiative to push a personal agenda?" Olivia met the reporter's gaze, her own unflinching. "If pushing for equity and justice is considered a personal agenda, then yes, I'm guilty. But let's not confuse a demand for progress with self-interest. This is not about me. It's about the future we're building for those who come after us." Another hand rose, this time a man in the back row. "And what about the email from your executive team? Doesn't it show a lack of confidence in your leadership? Olivia's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. The email reflects a difference in opinion, not a lack of confidence. Leadership isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about navigating it, and I've spent my entire career navigating challenges far greater than a single email. The crowd murmured, the tension shifting. Olivia felt the tide turning. But she knew the fight wasn't over. She ended the briefing with a clear, decisive statement. We will not waver. Harper Holdings is committed to this initiative because it's not just the right thing to do. It's the necessary thing to do. And I will see it through. Back in her office, the aftermath of the briefing buzzed through the building. Mara entered with a stack of papers, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and concern. That was incredible, Mara said, setting the papers on Olivia's desk. But they're already spinning it. Some of the headlines are calling you defiant. Olivia allowed herself a faint smile. Let them. Defiance is the first step toward progress. The moment was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, it was Robert. His expression was carefully neutral. But Olivia could see the tension in his posture. Dr. Carter, he said, stepping inside. A moment of your time? Olivia gestured for him to sit, her eyes narrowing slightly. What can I do for you, Robert? He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his suit jacket. I wanted to apologize for the email. It was poorly timed. Olivia tilted her head, her gaze sharp. Poorly timed, or poorly conceived? Robert's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. Both, he admitted. I underestimated your resolve, and I underestimated the importance of this initiative. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. It's not me you underestimated, Robert. It's the people this initiative is meant to serve. He nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily in the room. You're right, he said finally, and I'd like to help. Olivia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. If you're serious about that, then prove it. Actions speak louder than apologies. Robert stood, his shoulders straightening. You'll have my support. As he left, Olivia exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step. And sometimes, that was enough. She turned back to the window, watching as the city buzzed with life below. The road ahead was still uncertain, the challenges still mounting, but for the first time in weeks, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope. The cracks in the glass ceiling were growing. And one day, they would shatter entirely. The city was bathed in the amber glow of evening as Olivia Carter stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing against her like an invisible force. The media briefing earlier that day had been a battle. But it was here, in this intimate gathering with her employees, that the stakes felt higher. These were not reporters looking for soundbites. These were the people who kept Harper Holdings running. The workers, the visionaries, the quiet forces behind the company's success. The room was full, the air charged with anticipation. Olivia's gaze swept the faces before her, young and old, diverse in every way, yet united in their watchfulness. She knew why they had come. They were here not just to hear her speak, but to see if she could stand firm against the forces that sought to undermine her. To see if she could still lead. She adjusted the microphone, her movements deliberate, and began. Good evening, she said, her voice calm but steady. Thank you all for being here. I know it's been a challenging few days, and I want to take this opportunity to address not just the questions surrounding the initiative, but the deeper issues that have come to light. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Olivia took a deep breath and continued. We've heard the protests outside. We've read the headlines. And we've seen the doubts. The subtle ones and the overtones. About whether this company is moving in the right direction. Let me say this plainly. We are. Because moving forward, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only way to create real change. She paused, letting her words settle. But this isn't just about an initiative. It's about something much larger. It's about who we are as a company, as individuals, and as a society. It's about confronting the systems that have allowed inequity to thrive. Not just outside these walls, but within them. Olivia glanced toward the back of the room, where Robert stood leaning against the wall. His face was unreadable, but his presence was notable. He had chosen to be here. And that, at least, meant something. For too long, Olivia continued, we've allowed the unspoken to define our spaces. The quiet biases, the whispered doubts, the systemic barriers that tell some of us that we don't belong here. And I know that for many of you, this isn't theoretical, it's personal, it's lived. Her voice softened, but her conviction remained. I know this because it's my story. Too. Because I've been in rooms where my competence was questioned before I said a word. I've been on flights where the ownership of my success was doubted because of the color of my skin. And I've sat in boardrooms where decisions about the future were made without acknowledging the past. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A quiet acknowledgement of shared experience. Olivia felt it, that fragile but powerful thread of connection. And she leaned into it. But let me tell you something else, she said, her voice rising slightly. Every step forward I've taken, every wall I've broken down, has been a reminder that the fight is worth it. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. She stepped away from the podium, moving toward the edge of the stage. This initiative is not about charity. It's about justice. It's about recognizing the potential in places we've overlooked for too long. And yes, it's ambitious. Yes, it's risky. But progress always is. The audience was with her now. Their energy palpable. Olivia could see it in their faces. The quiet resolve. The flicker of hope that comes when someone speaks the truth aloud. And for those who doubt, she said, her gaze sweeping the room, let me be clear. I will not waver. I will not step back. Because this is bigger than me. It's bigger than any one of us. This is about building a legacy that says we did not stand still when it mattered most. The applause began slowly, building like a wave until it filled the room. Olivia stood still, letting the sound wash over her. It wasn't about validation. It was about solidarity, about the recognition that this moment, this fight, belonged to all of them. As the crowd began to disperse, Robert approached her. He looked hesitant, but there was something different in his expression. Something closer to respect. Dr. Carter, he began, his voice measured. I wanted to say, I was wrong. About the initiative. About you. Olivia studied him for a moment. Her face unreadable. What changed your mind? He hesitated, then gestured toward the room. Hearing you tonight. Seeing the way people responded. It's clear that this is more than a business decision. It's a movement. And I'd like to be part of it. She nodded, her expression softening just slightly. Good. Then let's get to work. Later that night, Olivia stood in her office, looking out over the city. The protests had quieted, the crowd dispersing as the evening settled in. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of both the challenges and the possibilities that lay ahead. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Marcus. Saw the speech online. Proud of you. Olivia smiled faintly, placing the phone back down. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices they had made to give her a chance at a better life. She thought of the countless others who had fought for justice in ways large and small. And she thought of the future she was determined to build, not just for herself, but for those who would come after her. The fight wasn't over. It never